I am going to talk to you over the next 25 minutes or so in relation to agentic AI and the challenges of bridging the privacy and accountability gap. But let's start off with the nightmare scenario. You've got an AI agent who deletes all of the emails in an inbox, despite having been given explicit instructions not to act unless it gets authorization to do so. Now, this isn't a hypothetical situation. It's actually a real-world example of an experiment that was conducted by an AI safety officer for one of the large tech companies. And what happened in practice is that the AI agent lost a key instruction and essentially defaulted to the original objective of cleaning up the inbox. And what's significant here is not that the AI agent failed, but how the AI agent failed. So it wasn't a malicious attack. It wasn't sort of some kind of hack. It was that the agent acted in a way that was unanticipated. And many organizations that are using Gen AI today, they're familiar with co-pilots, they're familiar with chatbots, and they see these agents as smarter automation when actually they are delegating, in many cases, key decision-making power to those agents. So over the course of the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to discuss essentially how we might think about governing the risks in that particular context. So by way of an overview, firstly, I'm going to look at the anatomy of an AI agent. And so we will essentially be answering the question, what does an agent do? And we'll see that there's this trajectory from AI simply responding to prompts to actually planning and executing specific tasks. We'll then briefly turn to the ICO Tech Futures report on agentic AI, and we'll discuss in particular how existing privacy concepts will be put under pressure by virtue of the risks posed by agentic AI. And then we'll turn to, well, how might we think about governing for these risks? Because existing governance programs don't necessarily address those risks as yet. And finally, I'll leave you with some key takeaways and try to map also these key takeaways onto some of the key responsibilities under the EU AI Act. So looking then at the anatomy of an AI agent, and I said this was about answering the question, well, what does an AI agent do? And we see that there's a number of potential things that an agent will do. It will detect events. It will connect to systems. It will make decisions. And it will execute tasks. So you'll see here already that it's not the case of there being step-by-step instructions. There isn't a response to prompts with a single defined output. And there's a good example given by the Spanish AEDP in its Agentic AI report, whereby an AI agent detects that you have a trip coming up in your calendar. It goes out to various services and systems. It compares those various services, and it automatically books those various services, be that a flight, be it a hotel booking, makes an order for your currency, as the case may be. So you can see here that this is a fundamental shift from AI simply producing one defined output to performing a number of tasks, making a number of decisions, and albeit it has an overall objective, it performs a number of open-ended tasks. So we can see that there's a number of key ingredients of an agent. So firstly, as the name suggests, they've got to have agency, some degree of autonomy to take decisions and to perform certain tasks. And they will display memory and planning and decision-making in that context. Now, the more defined the agency, the better from a risk perspective. A key element is also access to tools, because without tools, an agent cannot act. And it's about access to tools and data. And those tools might be, for example, an agent has access to your Google Calendar or to your LinkedIn or to your Yahoo Mail. It might have access to certain APIs or to various databases. And we'll see also that agents will be incentivized essentially to access as many databases as possible because that will often optimize performance. But you can see how that puts certain privacy principles under pressure. And then there will be a goal. Now, generally, there will be a degree of autonomy in how to achieve that goal, but there will be a specific task that it is intended that the AI agent would perform. So you're moving from responding to prompts to planning, deciding, and performing tasks. And the key inflection point, and this is one identified within the ICO's paper, is that combination of autonomy or agency and tool access. And that represents the fundamental shift. And that's what the ICO is responding to in its Tech Futures report. So turning briefly to that report then, there are a number of existing privacy concepts discussed by the ICO in that particular context, with a view to discussing how those principles are put under risk. So firstly, there's the possibility of purpose creep, because we said that the agent, albeit it has an overall objective, is in a position to perform a number of open-ended tasks and has a certain degree of autonomy vis-a-vis those tasks. So insofar as it may act in an unintended way, or it may exercise its autonomy in a way that wasn't envisaged at the time that the relevant personal data was collected, then we've got purpose limitation under strain. I've mentioned the fact that there'd be an incentive to give AI agents a broad access to databases, as much data as possible, in order to optimize their performance. And obviously, to that extent, you're going to have the principle of data minimization under strain. You've got reduced oversight insofar as you've got enhanced autonomy and potentially reduced involvement on the part of humans. And so from that perspective, you potentially have the ability for decision-making based solely on automated processing, which may have a legal or similarly significant effect. So that will trigger considerations under DUA and the GDPR. There's potentially significant transparency and explainability challenges. And that's because, again, we're not just dealing with a single defined output. We're seeing that decisions come from a chain. And from that perspective, it can be difficult to reconstruct how the agent made those decisions. And so, again, that means you've got that principle of transparency under strain. You potentially have accidental inference of sensitive data, because again, certain autonomy means that inferences are made. That's the whole point of, for example, LLM models. They're making inferences based on patterns that they identify between different data points. And that can lead to that accidental inference of sensitive data. Then you've got increased or different or new cyber and security risks. You potentially have the case of, malicious prompt injections, or you've got a greater attack surface by virtue of the fact that, again, the AI agent is often acting across, multiple platforms and making multiple decisions at various points in time. And then finally, and probably most importantly, you've got that accountability blur. So who is actually responsible? Because obviously, if you've got increased autonomy, increased decision-making by an agent, you've got a challenge around defining who is responsible for the decisions that that agent makes. And so those are all issues that are discussed within the report from the ICO. Now, what's very clear from the report is that it isn't by way of guidance. This is basically exploring where existing governance programs might fail. And so rather than give any kind of governance checklist, what the ICO does is it explores how agentic AI might essentially develop over the next 2 to 5 years. And we can see across these different 4 scenarios that it's the same privacy principles that are under pressure, but the visibility and the intensity and the degree of governability over the relevant risks varies according to the different scenarios. So the ICO discusses the first scenario of scarce and simple agents, so low capability, low adoption. And so the risks are largely similar to today's generative AI risks, so risks of hallucination, etc. Now, interpreting that, then the kind of takeaway, the practical implication of that seems to be that that would mean a low regulatory burden overall. So the issues will mainly arise from poor deployment rather than any kind of systemic risk. You then have a scenario where you've got low capability and high adoption. So the AI agent is or agentic AI generally is just good enough to be everywhere. Now that's likely to lead to a scenario of frequent errors, hallucinations, increased breaches, potentially no legal basis for processing. And so we can anticipate that there's likely to be a high volume of complaints, that there'll be risk driven by overuse of immature technology. The third scenario is agents in waiting, high capability, low adoption. So the risk stems there less from errors and more from a misuse of very powerful systems. In that situation, we can anticipate there's likely to be fewer regulatory cases, but they're going to be more complex. There's going to be a need for bespoke investigation and high stakes risk and high stakes assessments. And then finally, we have the fourth case scenario of ubiquitous agents, high capability, high adoption. Again, there's in that scenario, you're going to have potential for massive data flows, complex agent-to-agent processing, privacy erosion, and systemic risk. And we can anticipate there that agentic AI would be central to regulation, that there would be complex investigations as systemic governance challenges would dominate. So the ICO explores all of these scenarios with a view essentially to stress testing readiness across these different potential scenarios, and to kind of trigger governance professionals to start thinking about how they might address risk in these different scenarios. And probably one of the central takeaways from or key messages from the report is this idea that just because you're delegating autonomy doesn't mean you're shifting responsibility. And there's no defense of, it was the AI that did it. Now, there are some real challenges here because even the ICO acknowledges that determining who's acting as controller and who's acting as processor across multiple platforms and multiple vendors and multiple supply chains is actually really challenging. And I would add to that agentic AI also kind of poses a risk to that very clean, clear blue water between an AI deployer and an AI provider. Because anyone that's putting together, any organization that's putting together agentic AI workflows, they're not necessarily the provider of the underlying model. So for example, they might be using an LLM. However, they are combining that model with a number of different components. When they're putting together those agentic AI workflows, they're giving access to data. They might have some sort of user interface. And to that extent, they then become the provider of an AI system for the purposes of the EU AI Act. But of course, there's going to be the underlying model provider obligations, as well as the obligations on the provider of an AI system, particularly in the context of a high-risk AI system. So lots of complications to think through there. Key message, however, is that AI agency does not displace human or organizational responsibility. And that's where we come to thinking about, well, how do we start to think about governing these types of risks? And again, this isn't exhaustive, but the aim is just to give you some idea of the kinds of things that organizations should start thinking about. And I've organized it into 3 pillars. So essentially the first pillar being human control and accountability. And this is about answering the question, essentially, who is in charge? Because we've seen already that just because you delegate responsibility doesn't shift accountability. So we need to define who's in charge, who's giving the instructions to the AI agent, who's responsible for human oversight. Then we've got the piece around risk management and guardrails. That's about governing how the system works in practice. And what's clear here is that in the ICO paper, for example, the ICO sees agentic AI as a system. And we've seen already that it's not just about providing one defined output, as in the case of Gen AI. And so you need to look at what the system is doing in practice. And then finally, transparency and explainability. Can we reconstruct the decision-making chain? Can we justify what the agent does in practice? So looking at those briefly in a little bit more detail, there needs to be clear allocation of ownership and control. And that's, as I say, about making clear who is in charge, who's in the driving seat, who's driving the car, who's responsible for deployment, for oversight, for the key decisions. And then what about the mandate and permissions? And that's about defining what the objective or task of the AI agent is, and also what are the boundaries of its decision-making capability, what limits should be imposed on that agent. Very importantly, there's the human override point. So who is responsible for that human oversight? So establishing some kind of human oversight mechanism, and very importantly, the override and shutdown. Who is the person that has the kill switch, and what are the mechanisms for ensuring that that's activated in a particular situation? And also defining the ecosystem, and that's about defining the tools and the skills and the databases to which the AI agent should have access, and also ensuring accountability and responsibility around that. And so that was about who's in the driving seat. Pillar 2 is about, well, how do we keep the car on the road? So it's about how do we govern the way the system, consisting of a variety of components, acts in practice. And so guardrails and constraints is about having, those mechanisms in place to make sure the car does stay on the road. Access controls and least privilege is about restricting which systems that the agent can access, so what APIs it can access, what databases, and making sure that the principle of least privilege applies, so they have access to the minimum amount of databases, the minimum amount of tools. And, as privacy professionals, we're all familiar with the concept of privacy by default. It's a similar concept. You're giving access to the least amount of data, the least amount of tools, while also obviously ensuring that you're getting an acceptable level of performance. Monitoring and containment, that's about monitoring for adverse attacks. It's about for hallucinations, because of course, in a lot of these agents scenarios, you're dependent on the underlying large language model or the underlying model. And so all of the issues that we have with models like hallucinations, etc., they are going to be present as well. So monitoring for that, monitoring for adverse prompt injections. Containment, you might consider, for example, putting the agent within a sandbox or isolating the agent from other systems to minimize risk. And in a similar vein, think about separating planning and execution. So again, you're minimizing the risk of the agent doing something that wasn't intended, as illustrated in the opening example. And then Pillar 3 is about explainability. Can we defend the outcomes? And, it isn't always about ensuring perfect explainability, but it's about at least ensuring traceability. Can you look back and identify what the system did and when it did it, what tools it accessed, what databases it accessed? Do you have the appropriate logs and metrics in place to help you to do that? So, and it's about designing for that also from the outset. Agent inventory is absolutely key. And again, for privacy professionals who are familiar with ROPAs and the fundamental importance of understanding data flows, this is also key. Understanding what agents are deployed within your organization, what are their functions, what are they intended to achieve? So having that agent inventory. Attribution, so which agents and systems acted and under what authority? Are you able to attribute certain agents to certain actions to certain agents? And under what authority did they act, and in what context did they act? System cards and documentation, and again, you'll see this as a key theme throughout the requirements of the EU AI Act. Having that structured system card and documentation around, well, what's the purpose of the system? What are the limitations of the system? What's the design of the system? What are the risks of the system? And then finally, observability. And that's about interpreting the metrics, interpreting the logs. So in other words, being able to tell a story about how the agent acts in practice, observing the behavior of the AI system. Now, why this matters beyond privacy? Well, it's about systemic risk. We saw that agents are AI systems. And so it's not just about legal risk. The product design will not be able to bolt on explainability at a later stage. So you need to have explainability by design in the same way as you have privacy by design. Procurement are going to have to think about the fact that, notwithstanding that they might be using a third-party agent, that doesn't mean that they are delegating accountability, that there's still accountability on the part of that organization that is procuring that third-party agent. The governance teams need to be sure that they're not just addressing risk arising from existing AI tools like Gen AI, that they evolve beyond that. They recognize the risks posed by agentic AI and they uplift their governance programs accordingly. And then finally, regulatory exposure, recognizing that, again, this isn't about privacy. We have a convergence here of privacy, consumer law, competition law. So potentially you're going to have to deal with a multitude of regulators, be that the ICO or the Competition Markets Authority, or indeed the Digital Regulation Forum might have some sort of say. So by way of takeaway, I wanted to leave with 4 key messages. Accountability does not shift, regardless of autonomy. You're governing systems. You're not just governing outputs, as in the case of Gen AI. You need to design for traceability, even if you can't achieve perfect explainability. And you need to involve the relevant stakeholders at an early stage. So that's privacy, HR, risk, product teams, etc., and other relevant stakeholders, because agentic AI amplifies those silos in practice. And just by way of briefly mapping that onto the EU AI Act, if we look at the 3 pillars on the left-hand side, we see human control and accountability. Well, that's manifested within the EU AI Act insofar as there's clear definitions of what is a provider, what is a deployer, what do we mean by human oversight. What the Act is testing there is, well, can responsibility be clearly assigned? Is this a deployer responsibility? Is it a provider responsibility? Risk management and guardrails, we see many onerous provisions imposed on providers of high-risk AI systems in terms of robustness and monitoring, etc. And what the Act there is looking at is, well, are the risks constrained both before and after deployment? Transparency and explainability, again, that's manifested itself in a multitude of ways throughout the EU AI Act. We've got obligations around documentation, logging, user information in the context of high-risk system requirements. You've got specific onerous obligations in relation to providers of GPAI systems, particularly where there's systemic risk. And you've got Article 50 requirements under the relevant, from a transparency perspective. What the EU AI Act there is testing is, can that behaviour be the behaviour of the AI agent be understood? Can it be audited? Can it be challenged? And a final word on the draft EU Digital Omnibus package. Many of you will be aware that political agreement was reached on that relatively recently. It's not at the adoption phase yet, but it is expected that it will be adopted before August of this year. One of the key things that it does is that it pushes out the timelines for the applicability of certain provisions of the EU AI Act. Those timings are that the Gen AI content marking provisions are pushed out till December 2026. The provisions in relation to standalone high-risk systems are pushed out till the 2nd of December 2027. And the provisions in relation to AI embedded in regulated products are pushed out to the 2nd of August 2028. I wanted to leave you then with a quote from the ICO's Tech Futures report. While the potential benefits could be transformational, the public needs assurances that their personal information is secure and well managed before placing their trust in agentic systems. The key point is ensuring that you don't just see agentic AI as a smarter automation tool, that you recognize that in fact you are delegating responsibility, and that agentic AI does not remove responsibility, it amplifies it. Thank you.
Move fast and break things. That's the famous quote attributed to Mark Zuckerberg when he started Facebook. But that quote, which is born from the early days of Silicon Valley, I don't think fits the modern world. Today's environment is different. Tech is more ever interconnected. Customer trust is fragile. global digital regulation is vastly more complex. But still, we see commercial pressures driving the business to iterate new products, new features, and new services rapidly. So how should legal teams react to that? What this is not about is slowing down product development. But this is a chance for us to look again at product counselling with some fresh eyes, asking how mature are we as an organisation to manage the risks that are presented now. And importantly, asking how we as legal teams and compliance teams can be seen as more of an enabler, embedded into product design and a key partner for the business. So most modern products aren't dealing with a single regulatory regime. This is a snapshot of the scale of new digital regulation within Europe. This doesn't account for sector-specific stuff, doesn't look at wider compliance across Europe. It doesn't look about the global nature of regulation. And these regulations, they all sit within a wider contractual compliance and ethical risk portfolio. And the impact of addressing these is not real. It is real. In a recent survey, 1/3 of these asked of a survey said they missed a regulatory requirement in the past 12 months. Half of those surveys said they faced delayed or cancelled product launches, and a quarter suffered reputational damage. And too often, this lands at the legal team's door. They're perceived as being blockers. I mean, I think unfairly, but because of the advice, not because the advice is not commercial or because the advice itself, but often because how it's introduced and when it turns up. So today's session is looking at the most common friction points we see through the product life cycle. We'll look at each stage and ask from iteration down to rollout, what are the friction points? What is the impact? And what practical ways can legal teams reduce that friction? So the goal of today is not to promote a single right operating model, but to surface the patterns. Each of your businesses are different. Each have different challenges, different structures, different personalities. But using this framework, I think will help you look at the role through fresh eyes. And along the way, just as a bit of fun, we'll learn about icebergs, ancient Greek mythology, and my favourite, Chris Cartmell's growing toy car collection. So before we get into that detail, it's time for some audience participation. Chris.
Thank you, John. Morning, everyone. Oh, sorry. Hi, good morning, everyone. So before we dive into our excellent content, we'd love to get a quick sense of the room. John just discussed 5 different areas of friction that we and our clients see coming up again and again in product counselling. And these will be our areas of focus for today. However, we are very keen to see if our experience reflects yours. On the screen, you'll see a Slido poll. If you're able to get out your phones and scan the QR code, some of you have beaten me to it. Very good, thank you. We'd love to hear from you. Which of these feels like the most relevant friction point for your organisation right now? If there is something else troubling you, do select other. And if you're brave enough, perhaps you can share what that other friction area is with us in a moment. There's no right or wrong answer here. Every organisation is different. It's just a temperature check on what's actually causing you pain in practice. Just a reminder, the 5 areas are data minimisation, iteration quietly changing risk profile, we'll decide later, including lack of ownership of decisions, international rollout and localization, and hidden supply chain risks. So I'll just give you a moment or two. Last minute changes. I can't see any others. Oh, there are others. Good. Excellent, thank you. Perhaps we could start with those who put other. Do anyone brave enough to put their hand up and explain what other areas of friction they're facing in product counselling? Oh, we've got a hand at the back, actually. Thank you.
Thank you. Matthew Gregson from Unilever. One area we face challenge is we have lots of different teams involved in governance, partnering with the business to develop things. So you have privacy, security, legal, procurement, etc., etc. And it's navigating the various like sign-offs and inputs needed within a large organization to get things across the line.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, and it probably cuts across various elements of what we'll talk to in a moment, but it's a very valid point. Thank you. Great. Okay, thanks, everybody. Well, looking at the results, it looks like you've chosen two of John's as the top two. So thank you, everyone.
No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. So we'll, I guess without further delay, we'll move on to John's. The first topic we'll talk about as we go along the life cycle we talked about a moment ago is the ideation and strategy section. At this stage of the life cycle, our experience is the most common area of friction is the will get to it or lack of ownership point, which actually is your top one. So at least 33% of the room will enjoy this section of the course. So over to you, John.
Thank you. So we'll get to it. This shows up as delayed decision making, a lack of ownership, so decisions sitting between the legal teams, the product teams, the security teams, and the commercial teams. And it shows up as ignoring the problem and hoping it goes away, perhaps the head in the sand analogy. And this can be driven by a number of pretty understandable reasons. We saw how complex the European framework for digital regulation has got. There's also sometimes a lack of awareness about that level of complexity. Sometimes there's no clear ownership. And perhaps for certain non-regulated sectors, compliance isn't seen as fundamental to the product. And perhaps it's just not a priority. It's thought of we can fix it later. And as we heard from Leonie earlier, most regulations now include design requirements, which means it's not just a case of papering after the event. And this impact has hidden risk. It means no clear accountability when something goes wrong. It means inconsistent answers, whether that's to regulators, to partners, or to customers. It means decisions get made implicitly by engineers without legal or risk input. And it means design choices are made which are costly to undo. And clearly, when a regulator comes knocking, just saying we haven't got to it yet, or we haven't decided is really not a great answer. So, some practical solutions. Firstly, as Tony Blair famously said, and I'll use the point, Tony Blair's point, education, education, education. Help the business understand the importance of presenting and present this in a way which is meaningful to them. So, not focusing on regulatory fines, regulatory action, but the costs of this, the potential for delays, the missed sales opportunities. Embed the product counselling function within the business. This is the hearts and minds point. Invest the time to get to understand their pain points and work with them. I'm sure many of you in the room do this, but I think this is a chance to ask, could we be doing more? And how are we perceived by the business? And how can we change that perception? Thirdly, focus on regulatory themes and not on the regulations themselves. So issues like security, governance, incident response, these all feature across multiple of the regulatory regimes that we've seen on the screen. So surface them and address them holistically, rather than working piecemeal on regulation by regulation. That requires more input upfront, more costs and more investment upfront, but ultimately it's going to save you time and headaches down the line. And then finally, building clear governance upfront. So who makes decisions? Which decisions need to be made early? Which can genuinely wait? Remember, product counselling is a team sport, but someone needs to be accountable. And record what's been done, what hasn't, and the assumptions that are made, and ensure that those evolve with the product. Now, the aim here isn't to be perfect. It's about traceability, accountability, and transparency. And when you set up the process at the beginning, you can start to move on to the next design phase with some more confidence. Chris.
Thank you, John. John alluded to my toy car collection earlier. It's actually my young boys' toy car collection. Thanks, John. Second area is data minimization, effectively. And I mentioned my boys' car collection, and I want to give that some kind of context to what we're discussing today. You might have got the connection already, but I'll go through it anyway. So my two young boys, they love Hot Wheels. They're constantly asking for new cars, and they flatly refuse to throw any away that are broken or old. Why? Because the new ones are different, and the old ones, well, they might one day want to play with them. I'm sure many in the room know the result. My house is full of cars. It takes up space, gets in the way, aren't actually played with, and costs far too much time and money than they're worth. I assume this sounds familiar to you in the audience. Similarly with data, organizations sometimes treat data exactly the same way. Teams want to collect and retain more and more data than they actually need, just in case, for future features, for analytics, for AI training, or commercial insight. In reality, it's usually optimism rather than a clear strategy of what to do with that data. What you end up with is not optionality, it's clutter. And before long, instead of being an asset, data becomes something you're wading through. It's complex, it's costly, and risky to manage. The impact of overcollection is real. More breaches and D-star exposure. Clearly, the more data you have, the more can be impacted. The risk is not exclusive to GDPR. For example, the Data Act and the data sharing requirements for connected products. Again, the more data you have, the more you need to share. You can have a situation with more complex privacy notices and weaker purpose limitation arguments. How do you answer the question, what is the purpose of collecting the data? Just because? Higher cost in security, retention, and data mapping, not to mention the environmental impact of hosting all this data can have. From a regulatory perspective, future usefulness is not a lawful purpose, and just in case, doesn't sit comfortably with keeping data only for as long as necessary. So I've given you lots of challenges. What are the solutions? The most effective teams start by collecting only what they need at that moment in time and grow deliberately from there. So first, purpose-led scoping. Tie every data category to a live feature or function. Ask yourself the question, which feature will break if we don't have this data today? If the answer is hypothetical or future-facing, just don't collect it. Secondly, staged collection. Data is added as functionality matures. Ask yourself, what capability does this unlock? And is that capability even live or present? So we've put that into an example. A consumer health app. Phase one, you may collect some basic information like step count and activity type, enough to give some basic insights. Phase two, you might start collecting heart rate variability to provide personalized coaching. Phase three, you may introduce medical history to allow clinical integration. So this is a good example of stage collection. You don't need medical history on day one, but to unlock the clinical functionality later on, the data needs to provide it later. Finally, designing for reconsent. Rather than preloading everything or over-collecting to avoid future consent friction, strong teams design clear reconsent moments, concrete explanation of future value, modular permissions, discrete purpose-driven choices. Privacy user experience becomes a product capability rather than a compliance requirement. And users are told why new data is needed and what benefit it unlocks. And therefore, uptake is generally higher because the value is tangible to them. Similar to the kind of gradual collection of data in my health app example a moment ago. In our experience, the best teams don't minimize because they're cautious. They minimize because it keeps products movable. Data minimization done well is about preserving optionality, fewer irreversible decisions early, and more freedom later. So I'm going to test the audience mood here. So to end with a joke, what's the difference between data and Hot Wheels? No? A regulator, customer, or employees is unlikely to be concerned about the overcollection of Hot Wheels. So as we continue, as we continue along the product counselling lifestyle, next up is scale and localize. And first, the very thorny issue of supply chain risk, which John will talk to now.
I thought you nailed that, by the way.
Thank you.
Okay, hot whales to icebergs. 3 fun facts about icebergs. 1, they fizz when they melt. So trapped air bubbles from hundreds of years ago are escaping when they melt. Secondly, they have proper names. Baby icebergs are called bergy bits and growlers. And 90% of an iceberg is underwater, which is where we get the phrase tip of the iceberg and also a seamless transition to supply chain. So products are relying on a complex ecosystem nowadays. Third-party software, cloud services, analytics, AI models, all often embedded deep within the tech stack. So teams might understand the product well, but often have less visibility as to the supply chains that underpin this. So why do I think this is important? Most of the new digital regulations in some way targeted supply chain risk. In fact, the latest regulation from the EU on cybersecurity is focused on ICT supply chain security. Supply chains carry big cyber risk. So a recent study found 61% of the businesses had suffered a supply chain breach in the last year. 1/3 of those reported disruption or financial loss. And there's other risks, concentration risks, putting all your eggs in one basket, contractual risk about what the vendors are willing to give you to you about what versus what the customers are want to get from you, and broader compliance risks. And the impact of this is a mismatch between documentation and reality, what we say in the notices and the contractual terms and what we do. We talked about cyber risk and supply chain, but also exposure if vendors are repurposing data for things they shouldn't be using them. More complexity when it comes to breach management and notification analysis, and commercial shock when a vendor's practices become public. And in many of the enforcement cases and in a lot of the news which we've seen in the last couple of years, the weak point is the supply chain, not the core product. And I think while everyone knows this, in my view, this is going to be the focus of regulators in the next few years. And I think a number of businesses will be underprepared. So don't let that be you. So what can we do about this? Firstly, early vendor mapping alongside the product architecture. So you understand data flows, decision-making roles, and jurisdictional footprint. Categorizing suppliers by risk and data influence, not by contract or value. Who has access to meaningful data? How critical is the supply to the product? Often we see that is actually sitting in smaller value contracts within the supply chain, and those often get overlooked when it comes to assessments. Focus on the due diligence of those high risk or critical vendors, not just inflexible generic questionnaires. Contract with those vendors on actual data flows and risks. So ensure that all those key suppliers have appropriate practical and commercial levers in them. Recheck vendors as your product scale and features expand to make sure they're still compliant with assumptions you've made are still valid. And monitor contractual compliance to carry out audits if required. So, as I say, getting the supply chain right is going to be ever more important in the world of product counselling. And I think that's also going to be the case for our next friction points around global rollouts.
Thanks, John. So having spent 3 years in Hong Kong, being the APAC regional driver for cybersecurity and data protection for PwC, I'm very aware of the global challenges for organizations, particularly on rollout of products such as this. But in our experience, products are still often designed for one home market and then rolled out internationally as is. It usually starts with the unspoken assumption, build once, localize later, and can end with, why didn't anyone mention Germany? You can enter a high-risk jurisdiction of choice in there, but it's always the same. Certain jurisdictions create additional risks, and if you don't think about that up front, it's going to cause issues. Local laws, regulatory priorities, and cultural expectations are treated as things to fix later, something to localize once a product is built, rather than as a constraint to think about up front. The approach that approach can work while a product stays close to home, but once it starts reaching new markets, the cracks can appear. And suddenly teams are trying to fix problems across multiple countries all at once. In practice, we tend to see the same pattern repeat itself. Products go live in priority markets without meeting local requirements. Launches are delayed when local teams refuse to sign off. To the point earlier about the other kind of risk area, getting appropriate sign-offs, etc. in place. Consent, transparency, and governance features are added late and under pressure. And there's tension between global consistency and local legal reality. The result is slightly counterintuitive. International expansion slows things down rather than speed things up. As a lawyer, it pains me to say this, but what we see working is not heavy legal analysis everywhere. It's earlier structural decisions that let teams move quickly without losing control. Okay, so what can we do to try and minimize that risk? Separate global non-negotiables from local flex points and early. Before detailed build or localization starts, teams can clearly agree two things. Firstly, what cannot change globally? This may include minimum security and access standards, core data uses that define the product, or baseline expectations on transparency. Secondly, where local variation is allowed. This can be such as consent approvals, how employee data is handled, or regular facing processes. The key shift is agreeing early what must stay the same and where change is expected. That way, every new country doesn't reopen the same fundamental debates, and product teams can move forward with confidence. Secondly, screen high-risk jurisdictions early. Don't analyze everywhere in depth. Thank you, John. Oops. The aim here is triage, not perfection. Early on, teams identify markets which might require changes to the product design, markets that need extra governance or a different launch sequence, markets that are suitable for a fast rollout. That avoids discovering deal breakers after commercial commitments have already been made. As John mentioned earlier, focus on themes. These might include data localization rules, employee data laws, specific AI or automated decision-making requirements, and having an agreed methodology for determining what is deemed a high-risk market, like the example on the slide here, is key to undertaking this assessment. On this example, we've got a high-level example here, where you've got the themes or the risk dimension on the left-hand side. You risk those from 1 to 5, depending on the risks level associated with that particular category. You then add up your total when you've applied that across your jurisdiction analysis, and you come to a total amount, and by that you can assess which jurisdictions are higher or lower risk. Those hypothetical examples there are also just to give you an indication, and you won't be surprised to see that the EU and the UK are higher risk because of the regulatory landscape John talked to a moment ago. Interestingly, though, some organisations do take a deliberately high-risk first approach. For example, starting in Europe to set a high compliance bar and makes rollout elsewhere faster later on. Similar to the approach taken in GDPR back in the day. Another point to think about is putting governance around local deviations, so exceptions don't derail the roadmap. Local differences will happen. The key question is whether they're managed or accidental. What works is simple: explicit governance, clear thresholds for when deviations are allowed, named decision makers and escalation routes. Higher risk jurisdictions like the EU may require higher, more senior sign-off, a defined review process and timelines. The principle is straightforward. Local variation shouldn't derail the roadmap. It should sit within it. Speed comes from being global by default. Control comes from knowing where and how you flex. Okay, so we're coming to the end of our journey of friction across the product counselling lifecycle, and the final phase of The final phase is of iteration and change. And John is going to talk to you now about quiet iteration.
Chris. So we'll wrap up with some Greek mythology. So the ship of Theseus was owned by a mythical king, and every year the Athenians would commemorate the king by taking the vessel on a pilgrimage. And over time, various of the timbers of the ship rotted and were replaced. So the question that was raised by ancient philosophers was, if no pieces of the original remained in the current ship, was it still the original ship? And if it wasn't, when did it stop being the original ship? And in the world of product counselling, you should be asking the same question of your products. Modern products are designed to evolve continuously and quickly. Rapid release cycles, ongoing integrations, shifting commercial contexts, and AI rapidly deployed for features and functionality. And individually, each of these changes might look minor, but over time, these scale. And eventually, you end up with a fundamentally different product, perhaps with the same assumptions, the same controls, and the same approvals that you started with. And that can mean regulatory classification can change over time. New regulations might become in scope for your product, or new classifications within an existing regulation. Contract positions drift from what you say versus what you actually do. Compliance assumptions become stale. So what you assessed at the beginning versus what the reality is. And dependencies in supply chain evolve. So you have new vendors, new markets, and new exposures. And critically, these changes don't trigger often a formal review because each step feels a bit too small to justify it. But unchecked, this doesn't get exposed until regulatory scrutiny, a transaction or an audit, customer complaints, or a live incident. And clearly, those are not the right times to be looking at this again. So the goal, as we said throughout this presentation, is not to slow down iteration, but it's to ensure that we're risk aware and that evolves with the product. So what can we do? So not every sprint and new iteration needs legal input, but some changes should automatically trigger it. So new use cases or revenue models, expansion into new geographies, new categories of data or customers or counterparties, material UX or decision-making changes. So especially where we're looking at automated and AI-driven. And we've heard from Leonie about exactly why that's important. So think about using lightweight reassessment rather than full reapproval. So create applicability maps for regulations, which identify when a product might move from one regulation or classification to another. That means you're not doing that on the fly. What you'd want to do is do this up front. There's more investment needed, it's more time, but ultimately it means you won't have to be thinking about it when the product changes. Think about putting in some scheduled targeted check-ins rather than full design reviews, so you can work in partnership with the business. And embed the regulatory thinking within the product process. So make risks for decisions visible, build in prompts within the change workflow that trigger input from the legal teams, and align the product, legal, security, and commercial teams with what we would say would be a material change. And then finally, look at periodic risk resets. So where you've got a more mature product or a fast-moving product or fast-evolving product, revisit the whole risk profile periodically and ask, is it still within the regulatory classification? Is the contract position still accurate? Does its controls that you've put in place and the assumptions you've made still match? So to summarize all this stuff, when you're looking at evolving products in your business, I think you want to ask, is this still the same ship? And that's a question I don't think gets asked enough.
John, so how do I wrap all that up? So we've gone from Hot Wheels to Greek mythology to bring 3 growth facts on icebergs. So I think there's lots to take in there. I think the best thing to do is actually take a step back and look across the friction points we talked about today, which cover the product counselling lifecycle. On the surface, they look quite different. Too much data, global rollout surprises, decisions being parked, products quietly evolving. But underneath it all, they usually come from the same place. And you can actually throw in the Agentic AI session as well, the other talk to, which has a lot of the themes are consistent throughout the whole process. Friction doesn't happen because the law is impossibly complex. It happens because decisions are very late, made by default, are never really owned. And we see the same pattern again and again. Where no one's clearly owning decisions, risk just builds up in the background. When things are left open in the name of flexibility, product teams, engineers, or suppliers will fill the gap. And when legal input comes in late, it's felt as friction, not support. That shows up very clearly in the real world. Regulators across Europe are now receiving well over 400 personal data breaches every day, and that number is still climbing. In our experience, the organisations under the most pressure aren't the reckless ones. They're the ones that carry too much data for too long without clear decisions of ownership. None of this is about bad intent or people not trying hard enough. It's a timing and structure issue. What we talked about today isn't about building a perfect model or slowing products down. It's about making decisions earlier, clearer, and easier to repeat. Across all the friction points, the same themes keep coming up. Decide earlier what really needs a decision, and only defer what genuinely can wait. Be clear about what's global and where local flex is expected. Treat documentation and risk assessments as things that evolve, not one-off exercises, and put some light but real governance around change, so progress doesn't quietly turn into drift. None of this needs to be heavy, but it does need to be deliberate. If there's one practical takeaway to this, don't try to design product counselling in theory. Pick a real product, one that's live, growing, and under commercial pressure, and work from there. Think about who decides what happens when things change, when do you stop and reassess? That's where product counselling really works, when legal, product, security, and commercial teams line up early on how decisions will be made, not just what the answer is on a particular day. And that isn't just a legal issue, it's a commercial issue. In a survey by PwC, over 3/4 of senior executives now say compliance complexity is actively slowing down launches and expansion. When you dig into that a little bit, it nearly always comes down to decisions that were deferred rather than made early and revisited properly. For legal and compliance team, that also means staying close to products and people, engaging early, having real conversations, educating colleagues, and not relying solely on email once something goes wrong. When trust is there, challenge lands much better, and teams come together sooner. But why does this all matter now? Product counselling has been around for years. The environment products operated has shifted. John showed the legal and regulatory landscape we're operating in now earlier. We increasingly live in a world of masses of data. Products are more complex, and supply chains are harder to see. Change is constant. And increasingly, regulation is interested in how decisions are made, not what's written in a document. In that world, waiting doesn't really preserve flexibility, it just stalls up rework. The organisation that moves fastest aren't the ones ignoring risk, they're the ones that deal with it early, so it never becomes the thing that slows things down. The goal here isn't zero friction, some tension is actually healthy, but unmanaged friction creates delay, risk, and frustration. Sorry, I won't start again. The organisations that move fastest aren't the ones ignoring risk, they're the ones that deal with it early, so it never becomes a thing that slows it down. The goal isn't zero friction, some tension is actually healthy, but unmanaged friction creates delay, risk, and frustration. Handled well, legal input becomes part of the engine, maybe even the oil, helping products move faster with more confidence and fewer nasty surprises. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to make the case
for international transfers and why I think, and I think some of you may agree with me, you can tell me afterwards, that this should be going up the risk register. First off, let me set the scene. I'm going to start with some ancient history. So probably about nearly 30 years ago, we had the Data Protection Directive, and they introduced these really quite strict rules in Europe around transferring data outside of Europe. Now, why did they do that? It's always been about restricting access to that data from governments outside of Europe and concerns over them looking at our data. Now, fast forward almost 30 years later, we're now in a time of political and economic unrest and increasing concerns over governments accessing data. And at the same time, the value of that data and who has their hands on it and who doesn't have their hands on it has become an increasingly critical question. If it falls into the wrong hands, it's like our critical infrastructure, it can have devastating consequences for individuals, for businesses, and for nations. Now, I've put up here a quote from a speech from last month. This is from Richard Horn. He's the CEO of NCSC. I'm not going to read it out, but this just gives you a gist of the sentiment of heightening threat of government access to data and how it could be used. So what's the impact for us, those of us that are trying to keep the wheels turning? It means that there is increasing willingness around the world, not just in Europe, to have data protectionist measures in place and data localization and try and protect it from going outside, or if it goes outside, subject to strict requirements. And in Europe and the UK, we're seeing an increasing willingness to enforce our already existing rules with serious consequences. So that's my case for hoiking international transfers up the risk register. I rest my case, Your Honour. Now, I won't stop there. I'll carry on. I will give you a bit of oversight on what's been happening from a data transfers perspective over the past year. So as I said, we already have well-established regulations, and I'm sure many of you are not unfamiliar with the headaches of trying to navigate our international transfer rules for Europe and the UK. They've become increasingly complex over the years, and we can't actually blame Max Schrems for all of that. It has actually become a bit like escape the room, hasn't it, where you are trying to navigate your way out the door with your data. So let's take a look back over the past year at some of the key developments. Oh. Okay, so adequacy. What's the score? Over the past year, the EU, they granted adequacy to Brazil, and the EU renewed the UK's adequacy. There was a bit of nail biting over that. We didn't really know whether we were going to get it. I have to say, actually, I always had faith that we would get it. The UK hasn't granted any adequacies, so 2 points to Europe, 0 score to UK. How are we doing on guidance? Well, there's been some guidance on international transfers from Europe. First off, guidance on processor BCR recommendations that came out earlier in the year, but that has limited applicability. That's just if relevant to you if you're applying for or have processor BCRs. And then there were the guidelines on Article 48. They came out in June last year, but don't worry, you haven't missed much. It probably isn't applicable to you. That is around transfers under international agreements, which most of us don't have to worry about. So how did the UK do? Well, the UK published their new guidance or updated guidance on international transfers in January this year. Now, this guidance, unlike the EU's guidance, has very general, wide applicability. And to give you the headlines, it's sort of similar to the EU guidance, but it has some very helpful examples in it, so I'd recommend reading it if you haven't read it. and it diverges in one very important way from the EU guidelines, which is if you're transferring data from the UK, a key element you now have to consider is who instigated that transfer. Now, it sounds like a bit of a pain that you've got an extra thing to think about, but actually it can be quite helpful. So one of the examples is you've got a controller, they transfer their data to a processor in the UK. The processor is set up, so they have sub-processors around the world. They're transferring that data outside of the UK. It's the processor, because they've set things up that way, that instigated the transfer, and therefore, according to the UK's guidance, it's the processor's obligation to make sure that that transfer is compliant, which is actually quite helpful for the controller. So although I've given EU a score of 2 and the UK a score of 1, I think the UK should have bonus points for that very helpful bit of guidance. So where did we get to on the data privacy framework? Well, we had some wobbles over the last year. We had the Latoum case, which challenged the data privacy framework. That challenge failed. I have to say, I'm not surprised. There was so much work went into setting up the new data privacy framework so that it would withstand these sorts of challenges. It really isn't a surprise that it stood up to the challenge. The other big wobble that we had was that there were administration changes in the US, which looked like they may well undermine one of the core pillars on the data privacy framework. But that all settled down and we were okay. And I asked my colleague, Paul Lanois, who's in our Silicon Valley office, what's it looking like at the moment? I asked him for the inside track. He's one of the arbitrators on the data privacy scheme. So he has a bit of an insight as to what's going on. Unfortunately, Paul said, no, it's business as usual. Things really have calmed down. There haven't been any significant changes in the administration. It's just minor things. But we are not ruling out further challenges. So there may be more to come on this. Hopefully, again, they'll go the way of Latoum, but we need to watch this space. The big concern, if data privacy framework did fall over, given how popular it is and how many organizations are relying on it, is if you remember how long it took to get the data privacy framework in place, how complex those negotiations were, and then think about what the situation was then politically compared to what it is now, we would anticipate that actually it will take even longer to get a new version of the data privacy framework up and running again because of the added complexity. So that should remain a risk in the back of your mind. Where are we on binding corporate rules? I'll just say a little bit about this. Some of you may have binding corporate rules. It's obviously not as popular as things like standard contractual clauses or the privacy framework. It is still around for those of you that don't have it. It hasn't fallen away. Some organisations, are still applying for binding corporate rules because it does have its advantages. It's a lot of work, may even involve years of correspondence with regulators. But ultimately, there are advantages to binding corporate rules. They can stand as a really big trust mark for your organisation. So where do we stand? So the score is 15 for Europe over 2025 and 26 that have been approved. I don't know about the ICO. They don't publish the dates of their approvals, but we do a lot of binding corporate rules work in our data team, and we do know from all of that work that they are very, very busy. The reason it potentially is taking longer than usual to get your binding corporate rules or to go for your renewals is that actually there has been some added complexity in Europe, particularly, where there is more scrutiny. So it used to be the case that your lead authority would do the scrutinising, and all the authorities would go, great, we'll just rely on what the lead authority says. That is changing, and we're seeing much more scrutiny from more data protection regulators of your binding corporate rules, or even of your renewals of your binding corporate rules. So that's adding complexity, but also sort of an indication of the increased concern that regulators have around international transfers. The UK, again, scores some bonus points. They've actually introduced a mechanism which is a fast track to get your UK BCRs, which is if you've already got an EU BCR, you can use a UK appendix. It's a standard format, and more quickly get your UK BCR if you follow that standard format. And we haven't seen a great uptake of that, but that is largely due to the fact that many organisations have already been in this process for many years and invested a lot of time and effort in getting their documentation right. So that a lot of them will just be sticking with the old process. Now, a bit on the Data Use and Access Act. So we saw the introduction of our Data Use and Access Act recently in the UK, and this has introduced a new test for data transfers. But again, bonus points for the UK because we've lowered the bar. So under the EU GDPR rules, just to remind you, when transferring data outside of Europe, you had to make sure that there was essentially equivalent protections for that data. Now, the UK has introduced a test called the data protection test, which moved it from the protections must not be undermined to the protections must not be materially lower. So what that does, it opens up the door for you to transfer data, even if the protections are lower than the UK, as long as there's not a major gap there. So that's very helpful. They've also introduced more formally the requirement around having transfer risk assessments, which is the UK word for transfer impact assessment. And they've introduced that through the requirements to have reasonably and proportionately looked at things to be able to meet your data protection test. Now, looking at some notable transfer cases. For those of you that spotted that it refers to the Data Use and Access Act, what do these cases have to do with the Data Use and Access Act? The answer is nothing. That should say challenges and enforcement, but bonus points if you were paying attention and spotted that. So there's only one big case on this to mention, and that is TikTok. So TikTok was fined in May 25 by the Irish DPC, €530, and they were also required to suspend data transfers. Now, TikTok appealed the decision. That was in November. They appealed the decision, and then they were granted a stay last November, and the stay was around the transfers and the fine. The DPC appealed against that, and just last month, that appeal was dismissed. So that is still ticking on, and we will watch this space. But another one's just popped up that we'll be keeping an eye on, and this is Shein. So the DPC has opened an inquiry just at the end of last month, and again, with a focus on transfers of data to China. So we'll be watching that one closely. Now, I also just wanted to mention one that may have flown under the radar, and this is certification as an alternative transfer tool. So there is already a certification scheme that's been in place for a while, and this is the Euro Privacy Certification Scheme. So this is a seal of approval that was approved by the EDPB previously. What they have very recently done is sort of update that scheme to now allow for transfers under the scheme to importers outside of Europe. So in effect, it can be used as another type of transfer tool. Again, there hasn't been a huge amount of uptake on this, but I wouldn't be surprised if that starts to change now that this has been extended to being effectively a transfer tool. And the reason I think there might be more uptake now is because, of course, across Europe, there is now increasing regulation and very specific regulation around security requirements and protections for data and systems in the form of NIS2. We have the Cyber Resilience Act. We have the EU AI Act, as Leona was speaking about. So I wouldn't be surprised if organisations that are having to jump through all of those hoops from a compliance perspective may well start to look at these sorts of certifications and go, well, actually, we might have done quite a lot of the work already. Why don't we just go the extra mile and get the certification? So again, we shall watch this space. So just to round off then, so there has been quite a lot going on from an international transfers perspective over the past year. And I do think there is increasing regulator scrutiny and concern about transfers of data outside of Europe and outside of the UK. I predict that that escalation will continue over the coming years. And so what do we need to do, you as professionals looking out for the data of your businesses? Well, I think we need to pay close attention to what transfer mechanisms you have in place for transfers of your data, or even just checking that they are actually in place. If they are in place, are they robust enough? Are they, genuine transfer mechanisms that are going to stand up to scrutiny? Have you, for example, done all of your transfer risk assessments or transfer impact assessments? Will they stand up to scrutiny? Are you relying on the DPF for your own data transfers, or are you relying on it in terms of your processors and suppliers and their DPF certifications? What would happen if DPF falls over again? Do you have a backup plan? So those are a few things I think to keep in the back of the mind for the coming year. And if international transfers had dropped down your register of risk, I would make the case for hoisting it back up at least a few notches. And I look forward to hearing from you as to whether you agree with me in the breaks and over lunch. Thank you.
We have a panel involving friends and colleagues from around the Fieldfisher offices. We're going to talk about topics such as enforcement, what's happening in the digital world, and the practical trends that they're seeing in their practices right now. I feel I should be offering a little prize for those of you who can spot the same trends over all of the offices. I think there will be a few, but I still haven't quite worked it out in my mind. So what we're going to do is we're going to run along the line here. Everybody's going to get just under 10 minutes to introduce themselves and give their spiel on their, oh, sorry, I said that, Thorsten. Oh my God, it's just German. It's just coming out of my mind. For their particular country. We have allowed time at the end for questions. So please hold your questions. We expect some questions, and if you haven't got them, I've got a list of really nasty ones that I've been storing up for some time. So you need to save these guys from those questions. So I'm going to stop there and just hand over to my first colleague, Natalie. Over to you.
I'm the first Natalie of today.
Easier to stand up if you people will be able to see. Oh no, you can stand there.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay, so I come from Belgium. We are a small country. I think you know that. I thought there was a slide with a big piece of, you will see. So we have one data protection authority. Traditionally, it was very famous for being very small, not well organized, understaffed. So I can say this because I come from Belgium, but they have been working on it really hard over the last year. There has been a big reorganization, and now they are exiting, I would say, this transition period and are really ready to attack, if I can say so. So traditionally, there would be a lot of very small decisions or small fines or corrective measures linked to individual complaints. Now they have decided to change this and they want fewer cases with bigger amounts. So that's really the goal of this new data protection authority in Belgium. So the focus themes for them is accountability. That's the first one, being able to demonstrate compliance. They also focus on direct marketing, data brokerage, consent, dark patterns and cookie banners, data subject rights, international transfer is on the list as well, and compliance with previous decisions. So I will give you a few examples of enforcement case which I find interesting. The first one is a very recent case regarding employee mailbox. So the Data Protection Authority in Belgium has a very strict policy around mailbox of ex-employees. So I don't know how you do it in your company, but in this case, the company at stake had kept the employee mailbox for more than 2 years active, although this employee had left. So as if the employee was still there. So the Data Protection Authority said, you cannot do this. And what you should do is actually deactivate the account immediately as soon as the person has left. And you need to delete it forever after 1 month. Okay, so what you can do is have an out of office, that's it. And if you want to access any kind of employee mailbox once the person has left, you need consent and you need to do it in the presence of the employee. So that's really how strict the Belgian authorities in Belgium. So they wanted to emphasize this in this case. A few other interesting decisions. One about data brokerage. So in this case, it was about reuse of data for direct marketing. The company was relying on consent for this, which is good. You would think we have opt-in in place. We are pretty confident we can reuse this data, but they couldn't demonstrate their compliance. Okay, so there was an opt-in in the CRM, but they couldn't show the actual consent. So this is also to demonstrate how important it is to be able to show evidence of whatever your legal ground is. Another decision which was interesting was about cookie banner. There, the Data Protection Authority was focusing on the design and saying that there should be symmetry in terms of shape and feel and look and like of accept and reject button. So you can see that the Data Protection Authority is not really doing a legal analysis there, but is really discussing design and user experience, and that all companies should avoid dark patterns and any kind of design that would, make you push on the accept button. I think this is a common theme for most Data Protection Authority. Then there was a decision about FATCA, the FATCA, this US federal law to prevent tax evasion. The Data Protection Authority said that the transfer of bank account data to the US was against GDPR. This decision is being challenged now in appeal, and there is a preliminary question to the European Court of Justice as well. Then there was a Google decision, because there is always one, regarding a request for delisting. And there, I think it was interesting, the Data Protection Authority said, if you want to refuse such a delisting request, you cannot do it in a standardized way. So you should have like a tailor-made specific communication to the data subject. It cannot be a generic text. And then last but not least, also an interesting decision, I think it's very Belgian, in the way that the Data Protection Authority was doing a lot of corrective measure decision or reprimand decisions. If you don't comply to a first decision, then you will be sanctioned a second time with a new decision saying you should comply to the first one, and for this we are giving you a fine. So this just to say, please take into account, our decisions. On top of this, I wanted to flag new guidelines around direct marketing. The Belgian Data Protection Authority, as I said, is very active on this and wants to make sure that user experience is taken into account when it comes to promotional campaign profiling or whatever. A quick word on NIS2. There are many good points for Belgium. Yes, because we were one of the first to have a law. Actually, our law is 2 years old, so for implementing NIS2. So we are now in an operational mode, and the Cybersecurity Authority has been publishing a lot of guidance and a lot of really interesting tools to help you. Yeah, people do this so they know. So Belgium is famous for this. We have a notification guide. We have frequently asked questions with tool allowing you to assess what kind of entity you are. So this is really interesting. On top of this, the Belgian Data Protection Authority has worked on guidance around AI. I think like most national authorities, they've been publishing guidelines on how to be compliant with GDPR in your AI systems. Do I still have a few minutes? Because I see
2 minutes.
Oh, okay, that's fantastic. I wanted to mention also the annual report that I have been looking at, and it's actually flagging the priorities of the national authority. And there they were mentioning high-risk processing activities, large-scale processing activities. So this is really common. You find this each year. But this year they pointed out public and private sector, health authorities. So health data is also at stake in Belgium. Profiling, and as I said, direct marketing and data brokerage. So those are the priority topic. They were also mentioning children protection, and I know this is also a big topic in the UK. So this is also flagged in this annual report. And then we have AI and emerging technologies, all the risks, data protection risks that are linked to this. And then compliance with EU digital regulations. So this is for Belgium. I give us 12 points.
Okay, excellent. Well done. Belgium, 12 points. Spain, what can you do? Let's see it.
Well, we're not in Eurovision this year. As you all know. Right. Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Perez, and I am one of the partners at the Tech and Data Practice at Fieldfisher in Spain. And what I would like to explain briefly from the view from Spain is just how active the Data Protection Agency is on procedures and fines and guidance, etc. And we'll have a second block on how the digital regulation is, and then the hot topics. And when we were choosing the picture for Spain, I mean, you should be expecting maybe sunny beaches or golf courses or something like that. But you will understand later on why we have a traffic jam, but that will go later on when we talk about the digital regulation. First, let me just explain. Very similar as it happened to Belgium, the Spanish Data Protection Authority releases every year a yearly report together, and this year it has gone out together with the strategic plans for the next 5 years. Well, the strategic plans is basically how the Spanish regulator is willing to perform in the coming years, and basically it has decided just to follow 7 paths and 7 axes, just to be, let's say, let me read it because it's difficult to remember, but basically they want to be a smart agency and involve AI in all their procedures and investigations and inquiries, etc. So this is what they're willing to do, and also bring technological innovation in all their work. They also want to facilitate regulatory compliance and regulatory support to companies, to data controllers, data processors, and also yet to the government in the implementation of legislation. Although I think that they might be failing on this, as you will see later on. They also are willing to have international leadership and just to bring in their ideas on data privacy, both to European regulators and also in the Hispanic Americas, because there's a really close bond with the agencies in Latin America in that field. And also just doing continuous improvement and reinforcing the citizenship with awareness and campaigns. Some of them I will explain later on. But what's interesting is that it's the activity in enforcement in the what it's explained in the yearly summary. So basically, the main headlines here is that the Spanish authority is a very active authority in terms of investigations, but it's not that severe in terms of the amount of fines. So just to give you, I mean, the summary is in 2025, the agency imposed 299, nearly 300 fines. But the overall amount was 40 million euros. So there are countries that, like France or Germany or even the UK, that in one single fine, I mean, they are above that amount. So this means that they're active, but they're not that severe. But let me explain what would be the top 6 that happen in 2025. And as you will see, the trend in most of them is biometry. So it really is a sensitive thing for the Spanish authority. So the first one is the Spanish authority on airports was imposed a fine of 10 million euro because of using of biometry data without a proper DPII in place and without a proper risk analysis developed. And basically, they wanted to use it not for the control at customs or at the entry of citizens. It was for internal purposes. And the investigation and the inquiry were demonstrated is that was deployed without a proper DPIA and without a proper risk assessment being deployed. Which is really interesting because this is setting a trend in Spain. If you don't have a proper DPIA really well developed and really properly implemented, that could trigger you to a fine. And that would apply not only to biometry, it would apply to AI systems that we're implementing, other things that we are now becoming more popular in companies. So we have to keep an eye on that. The 2 following fines are related with massive data breaches. There were 2 companies, generally the insurance company, they had a massive data breach, or they have a data breach implying sensitive data. And there is, sorry, got to read this again, there's another company named Sprinter Megacentros who had also a massive data breach, not involving sensitive data, but it was impacting 6 million data subjects. So the result is that the outcome of these 2 fines is that you have to be very careful when you notify a data breach to the agency. Because depending on what you explain, you will be welcoming their appetite to investigate and impose fines because of having insufficient security measures. So you have to be very, very careful because both of them, they were triggered by an initial data breach notification. So you have to be, on top of really just implementing proper security measures, you have to be very careful on how to notify it to the regulator. The next one is the company Orange was imposed a fine of 1.2 million euro because of SIM swapping situation. They didn't have, or it was proven that they didn't have security enough to avoid users using SIM cards from other users. So since there was let's say, an unlawful use of identity, and again, this is triggering the fact that they didn't have enough security measures to prevent that risk. So again, they were imposed a fine on that. And the last 2, it's related, sorry if you don't follow football, I'm quite a footballer, and you can imagine I'm very happy these days after we won the Liga, especially against Real Madrid. You can see that I'm a Barca supporter, but Barca was imposed a fine of €500,000 because they were using facial recognition, not for security, for the access to the stadium. They were using it to update the list of members for the voting process. So the Spanish regulator said, why are you using this? You have other alternative ways to identify this and to update this information. And again, you didn't have a proper DPIA in place, so €500,000 goes. And La Liga, which is the owner of the rights and it's gathering all the football clubs in Spain, they were imposed a fine by using biometry in the access to the stadiums. And again, they were saying, no, you can use another alternative means of control, which are less intrusive. So there goes €1 million. So these are the top 6 fines imposed by the Data Protection Agency in 2025. So as you see, biometry and security measures are quite a thing. Let me just finish by saying that, well, it's not just the regulator. You have to bear in mind the courts of justice. Because most of these decisions are challenged before the courts of justice. And some of these challenges prevail, but some of them don't. And let me just mention two important decisions that were published in Spain, judicial decisions in 2025. One of them was a decision by the Supreme Court confirming this concept of what they define it as dynamic concept of personal data, something that it is already foreseen in the European Court of Justice jurisprudence, which basically says the same data set, it can be pseudonymized data for one side of the relationship, While for another side of the relationship, it can be anonymized data. If that second part in the relationship doesn't have the means to re-identify who is the individual behind or the individuals behind the data set. And that is applied to a situation on sharing information with works council, etc. Anyway, basically, they were confirming that situation, which is, it can be really useful because it can help to a number of processings that maybe if we are able to prove that there's a side in the relationship that doesn't have the means to identify the individuals, and it's not processing personal data. And that could go, for instance, for training AI systems, for research projects, for clinical trials. That could be really, really helpful. Having that decision by the Supreme Court is giving us a precedent that is really, really helpful in implementing some of the policies that we might need to put in place. The second one, which is really interesting, is that in Spain, we have regional governments and we also have regional high courts for some of the things, some of the judicial processes. For the employment judicial processes, we have the high courts are in the region. So the High Court of Galicia, northwestern Spain, beautiful part of Spain, if you don't know it, excellent food. But they released the decision. Yeah, it's really amazing. But they released the decision, again, on the use of biometry. So basically what they said, the use of biometry was unlawful, but on top of implying a breach on data protection legislation, it is a negative impact for the image and the honor of the individual. So that individual is allowed to get a compensation of damages because of that. And that person, that employee, was awarded 54,000 euro in damages, in moral damages, for unlawful use of its image. So again, together with the fine, be careful because maybe it might be people not implement or companies not implementing this properly might be facing this situation, and also compensations for the moral damages. So I think it's really an interesting decision. So moving to something completely different, like Monty Python would say, but not really. The guidance that the Spanish Data Protection Agency has been issuing during 2025, all of them related with artificial intelligence, all of them. So there are 3 initiatives that they launched. One, they released a video on deepfake initiatives, just giving awareness and guidance to the citizenship about the risk of that and how you can avoid them. For instance, it includes a tip which we use in our family. In our family, we have a password. So if anyone is calling me and say, "Hey, Daddy, I'm in trouble. Can you send some money?" Then I say, "What's the password?" They don't reply. It's a fake. It's a recommendation. I learned it some months ago, and it's really useful. And it has happened some time to me. Sometimes I receive, messages in my phone. "Daddy, I'm in trouble. Password, no reply. Get away." The second guideline that was published is on the use of third-party images on AI systems. So again, what's exposure, the need to consent, or the need of legal grounds, and how you can handle this. And the third one is, this is really, you've listened to Leonie Power at the beginning on Agentic AI. The Spanish Data Protection Authority also released a very, very thorough guidelines on privacy for AI agents. And it's really, really, I think it can be really complement the work that the ICO has been doing, because it has a full description of risks, how to handle them, how to avoid them, really, really useful. So very quickly, and just to finish, why this stagnation image? Because for the digital regulations in Spain, nothing has been approved. So we are waiting but the problem is that the parliament in Spain, it has such a very delicate balance that the government now, if there is only one party that is supporting them that says no laws can be passed. So this means that we don't have a penalty regime for the AI regulation. We don't have it. We have not implemented an NIS2 yet. We have no penalty regime for the Data Act. We don't have the penalty regime for the DSA. Even the digital coordinator has to be appointed, and it was recently blocked at Parliament. So we don't have an appointed authority. So there we are in a stagnation. And finally, that's the last topic. The hot topic is there's been a law recently approved on customer support services. And maybe I can explain that later on more in detail in the Q&A. But basically, there is one thing, and this is how I think that the Spanish Data Protection Authority was not doing really a good job in advising in lawmaking, because that law is saying that the calls with customers during customer support can only be recorded if the customer has provided prior consent. and pays no attention to any other possible legal grounds on processing that, which is making it very difficult for companies to do that. But maybe we can talk more in detail about this legislation. It has very, very detailed obligations on quality, differentiation on calling lines, etc., etc. So this is my bit from Spain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. We're going to have to do voting later, I think. But Carlos is available for advice on eating in Spain and playing a guitar. I now know he plays in a band. I mean, the man, his talents are limitless. Right, on to another lady whose talents are limitless. Natalie Farmer is going to tell us about the USA.
Thank you very much. Second Natalie of the panel. I am a partner in the tech and data team at Fieldfisher, affiliated with the Silicon Valley office. I spent a couple of years working out in Palo Alto, and my clients largely are either US based and looking to comply with EU and UK laws and regulations, or global based, but with a presence or some reason to need to pay attention to the US. As you'll probably know, it's a materially different legal landscape in the US. So we don't have a federal privacy or AI law, and this means that we have quite a fragmented approach to regulation, both on the privacy and the AI space. On the privacy front, we've seen a significant movement towards legislation. So there are now 21 out of 50 states with data protection laws. The closest sort of comprehensive omnibus type law to the GDPR, of course, being CCPA in California. And then other state laws are relatively narrow by comparison. We have a divergence of approach to regulation of those state laws. So for the most part, it's the attorney generals of each state that are tasked with policing and enforcing the state laws. The exception is California, who have their own privacy regulator. But what that means is you've already got sort of very resource-strapped AGs being tasked with privacy enforcement as well. So we see a different level of enforcement depending on the state. And by and large, the majority of the regulatory enforcement that we see comes out of California, although not only. At the federal level, the gap created by the lack of a federal law is plugged to some extent by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, who use their very broad powers under Section 5 of the FTC Act to police and enforce against deceptive and unfair practices, including with respect to the use of personal data and any unfair and deceptive practices that affect consumers. What that tends to look like is them using a power that's not dissimilar to regulating on the principle of unlawfulness, fairness and transparency under the GDPR, for example. And they have taken that power and used it as far and overstretched it as far as they can to, again, as I said, sort of plug the gap left by the lack of a federal law. Similarly, with respect to the regulation of AI technologies, no federal law, and we have a patchwork of relatively narrow state-by-state AI laws. Some of them regulate a particular processing purpose or a particular AI purpose. So we see the regulation of biometric technologies, for example, facial recognition technologies and similar. And we also see sectoral-based laws. So, for example, there are laws that regulate just the use of algorithmic decision-making in insurance underwriting, for example. What we don't have is anything close to an EU AI Act type law. The closest we came was in Colorado, where we did have an EU AI Act light, if you like. That law has recently been repealed and will be replaced with a more narrow ADMT law, so an automated decision-making technology law. The political impetus for that is that there is a general trend in the US to try and stay very competitive when it comes to AI, and that means deregulation, if anything. That's also represented through the recent and modestly named Trump America AI Act, which is now proceeding through the legislative process. It's very early days, and I don't think we're going to see that become a law anytime soon. But again, it's a codification of the executive orders in the US, which by and large have focused on safety and fairness at the federal level and the public authority level. There is some limited language in the bill which talks about mitigation of perceived or foreseeable harms, but it certainly isn't a piece of legislation that goes to the regulation of high-risk AI systems in the way that the EU AI Act does.
So the results, and I just mentioned the FTC have also been willing to use their Section 5 FTC Act powers also to cover AI, taking unfair and deceptive practices and extending that out to biased and misleading AI practice, which we'll come back to as well. So the result is less legal certainty, potentially more flexibility in some cases, but an increasingly difficult set of rules to navigate. There are varied enforcement levels across the US, depending on the state. And obviously, the FTC's enforcement priorities will trend it towards certain types of technology or practices. There's also that constant spectre of FTC enforcement, which, given the broad powers under the FTC Act, is a little bit ambiguous and vague. So you do have to be looking to trends in order to spot where the FTC may place its resource. But importantly, despite the absence of comprehensive rules, there's no lack of enforcement in the space. In California, in just the last 6 months, so just giving you a snapshot of the last 6 months, we've seen Attorney General enforcement against Disney, which resulted in a $2.75 million settlement. That was for failure to honour opt-outs. We've seen enforcement again from the Attorney General against Jam City, a gaming app developer, again failing to honour opt-outs and consumer choice, and that was compounded by the fact that the users on the platform were under 16, so minors. And just this week, so this one's hot off the press, we saw the largest CCPA penalty to date, which is $12.75 million in a joint settlement between the Attorney General and Cal Privacy, the Californian regulator, against General Motors. There they had been collecting geolocation and other connected vehicle data and selling and sharing that data in direct, sort of contrary rather to the direct representations that were made to the data subjects. So that's the biggest one we've seen from Cal Privacy and the California AG under CCPA. Some other state enforcement sort of honourable mentions. We have some pretty huge enforcement against Meta. So it's not only the European regulators that come after the big US tech platforms. The Texas Attorney General and the Illinois Attorney General both enforced against Meta for the use of their biometric facial recognition technologies on the Facebook platform. The settlement in the Texan case was $1.4 billion. And in Illinois, under BIPA, which is the Biometric Information Privacy Act, $650 million. So it's material enforcement and settlement against Meta for biometric use. You'll note that we're talking a lot of the time here about settlements with the Attorneys General and Cal Privacy. So these are not fines that will be appealed or challenged. They've been agreed with the relevant companies. And so, you know, unlike when we get enforcement from EU regulators and it may then get appealed, we know that these have been agreed. Just looking at some more federal enforcement then. The FTC have enforced against Disney. This was in September 2025. They issued a $10 million civil penalty for failing to get the proper consent of users on the Disney YouTube platform. So there needs to be parental consent under COPPA, that's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. There was a fine in that case, that was under COPPA where you can fine. Under Section 5 of the FTC Act, first violations don't normally attract fines. So COPPA is an interesting one. It's easier to get a fine via COPPA. FTC, generally speaking, first violation, you get away with it. An example of that first violation approach was in the GoDaddy case, May 2025 last year. There were a number of data security misrepresentations according to the FTC, where GoDaddy had claimed award-winning security, but then sustained multiple breaches. So under that Section 5 power, they brought a enforcement. They focused on removing the misrepresentations, orders around better security implementation, but no fine. On the AI front, FTC is focused on so-called AI whitewashing. So this is making representations about the efficacy or accuracy of your AI that don't stand up to the way that the systems actually work. Helpfully for us in this room, an enforcement against a company was taken that were advertising the first ever robot lawyer. And the FTC said, you can't possibly have a robot that's as good as a lawyer. So they did fine them in that case, $200,000. They've also been very active in the policing of biometric recognition technologies. Probably the most alarming case was the Rite Aid case. So Rite Aid are a pharmacy in the US. They had put biometric facial recognition technology in their stores. apparently to identify people of interest, which really just meant people they thought were going to steal from them. Those systems were found to be largely inaccurate, and they resulted in biased and discriminatory outcomes. There was no fine in this case, which I think is the alarming part of this, because I think we don't even really need to know more details to know that would be high risk under the EU AI Act and probably prohibited if you applied the principles of the GDPR. But the reason we have the angry mob on the screen, and this is really the area where the US diverges the most, and the thing that we care about, frankly, most in the US, is the plaintiff bar. So there is a very active plaintiff bar in the US, and they have been very creative in taking laws that were not necessarily always intended to be used for privacy and AI-related class actions and reinventing them to plug, again, that gap created by the lack of a federal privacy or AI law. I'm just going to mention two that are particularly interesting and that we've seen take off quite quickly. So first, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. So the Fair Credit Reporting Act is a federal law under which decisions that are taken algorithmically to determine your sort of credit score, or creating a consumer report about you that would go to whether you get access to credit, require a great deal of sort of prior notice. Now, the plaintiff bar has repurposed that law to say that the same would apply if you used automated decision making, essentially to take HR-related decisions or to take decisions on tenancy applications. In the tenancy application space, those claims have been quite successful and resulted in a number of settlements in the tens of millions. We are now seeing a flood of cases to the courts under the same premise with respect to automated decision-making related to HR decision-making. So we don't have any settlements there yet. There is a big case going through the California court against Eightfold. We'll watch that with interest. But this is an example of those federal laws being creatively repurposed to plug a gap that the law creates. Another example that you might be more aware of is the Electronic Communications Privacy Act. This is the old wiretapping law. It's a law from the 1980s. It was not intended to be used by plaintiffs to say that cookies and similar technologies were intercepting communications, but that's exactly what the plaintiff bar has done. There is a question mark over whether that is a valid legal argument, but it's been ran and there's been a great deal of settlements in the space as well, including a $68 million settlement by Google for the use of their Google Assistant feature, which the plaintiffs alleged was switched on by default and therefore intercepting their communications without any prior action of the user. And again, while the courts are not settled on whether the ECPA can be used in this way, given the possibility of very large plaintiff claims and the cost of defence in the US, these do tend to get settled. What that means is, if all the cases are being settled, we don't really have valuable court jurisprudence to then rely on to say that these claims aren't valid. And so the settlements continue, the plaintiff actions grow, and we have a very ripe landscape for further plaintiff actions. The themes then that we can draw from all of this, there's a ton of overlap with the things that we care about from an EU and UK perspective. Algorithmic transparency, if you think about FCRA, consent for online tracking, if you think of ECPA. There's also BIPA, which is used for class actions as well. That's the Biometric Information Privacy Act in Illinois. And so we are caring very much about the same things we care about in the EU and the UK, just under a very different guise. And that's me done.
Thank you very much, USA. Right, Germany, what do you have to offer?
Thanks a lot, Hazel. Thanks for having me, everyone. How we set for time? We're okay. Yeah, we're fine. I'll try to focus on a couple of points. I would agree, Hazel. I think I've spotted a couple of commonalities. I'll try to pick a few of them. What I'll try to pick up first, Natalie, is this plaintiff landscape that you've just described. So I often act as a DPO for clients, data protection officer, but not always. I don't go to court. And I was wondering, maybe I can ask for a show of hands in the room, a bit about roles. It's not a test, but I did want to ask, who would consider themselves to be sort of in a GRC role? Governance, risk, compliance, rather than contractual. It's not a test. I won't ask again in the end. Any litigators, not necessarily barristers or the like, maybe working towards litigation for your direct colleagues? Oh, interesting. Not so many. I'm asking because it works very differently in Germany, where I practice. I'm a partner in the Hamburg office, and we defend a lot of platform clients against maybe small claims, is what you might call it here, but works differently in the sense that you'll have consumer law firms trying to siphon fees. I'm going to be a bit negative about the whole business model, and also because of my personal beliefs how this all plays out in real life. So the way it works is after data breach, maybe they'll use Google AdWords, maybe send advertisement on platforms and try to rake in dozens or maybe hundreds of consumers. And maybe older people like me might feel reminded of another German setup that was Dieselgate at the time. So we see the same consumer firms going after platforms using GDPR and in the future other acts, I'm pretty sure, using those to come after those companies. And it's not about those millions or tens of millions in settlements that Natalie has just mentioned. It is about getting a couple hundred, maybe low four-digit sums, but ideally for hundreds, maybe thousands of claimants, consumers in the end. And the real problem for platforms usually is the cost involved at the other end, because we don't have these kinds of mass claims proceedings in this area. So in Dieselgate, you had to deal with literally tens of thousands of, not just sheets of paper, stacks of paper, delivered physically to courts. Today, it's usually electronically, but it's still individual claims. You need your processes internally to be able to deal with those. You cannot prepare fully. That's not possible, or it's cost prohibitive. You can't do that, but you need to be aware how this piece of enforcement works. That's really important because you have to spot the signs. This is what we do for clients, where we spot them, where we know like 1 to 2 dozen types of consumer firms that reappear across clients in the country. So just so you're aware, if you see maybe 5 of those, maybe it's just starting a test somewhere, finding a court that's amenable to this claim, and then bringing more, because you might have jurisdiction across the country, actually. That's another issue in litigation. The other thing I wanted to mention, actually, can I ask, who of you is present in the German market in the sense of having an office or selling into the market? Oh, that's a lot. Okay. No litigators, but lots of German business. Have you come across the problem of being active in different parts of, yeah, okay, people nodding, because we apply federalism to that in the sense that we have 18 privacy regulators alone, plus sector-specific ones. So 1 at the federal level, 70 at federal state level, 16 states. One of them has 2 of those. And then the sector-specific ones. So that alone is job security for lawyers in Germany. I can't really complain, but it's a real mess. People have been trying to harmonize that, to aggregate this into 1 federal regulator, but it's not really working out because of constitutional federalism, mostly. I'm not going to be or play police, but we do want to speak about enforcement a bit. I've brought a few cases maybe to focus on. One is, Carlos, you said that Spain has lots of small fines. I would say in Germany, you don't have that many fines from the data protection supervisory authorities. And they're usually not that high, but you were right still, Carlos, because we had one from last year against Vodafone, which was 8-digit, 45 million. Actually 2 fines. That was real news, I have to say. That's very unusual in Germany. And there's a couple of interesting things between the lines, I believe. Maybe you can think about them for your own organization. So really it was about vendor management, Article 28. Apparently that wasn't handled well, probably, I don't know, I was involved, but probably not documented well either. And they didn't have the right things, contracts, documents in place, I can only gather. The other one was over Article 32, and you've also mentioned, Carlos, SIM cards. This was about virtual SIM cards. third-party access to those. So 15 and 30 million, 45 and a whole. And possibly the most interesting bit is this was accepted and has been paid in full, period. So this got me thinking, maybe that's interesting to you, what must have happened in those 2-3 years before the press release? How do you accept this kind of fine, that level, mid-8 digit? That, if you think about your own GSC organization, your governance, your functions, your roles, the amount of memos leading to that situation, accepting that fine. As I said, I work a lot as a DPO in organizations, not making decisions, obviously, about data processing, but being involved in decision making and around protecting personal data in processing. Maybe there's more there. I was really baffled why we didn't see an appeal. This is speculative. Maybe there was more in the background. But again, I don't know any about that. Another area where the German GDPR regulators are really zealous, I have to say, you'll think they're probably generally zealous, and you're not entirely wrong. But one of the areas where it's really difficult and hard to convince them is CCTV, which is probably very different to the UK. If you look outside, there have been cases brought against public transport over CCTV, which makes you wonder, if it's necessary anywhere, where should it be if not public transport? And they've often lost, actually. They've gone after dash cam users, dash cams in cars, which sounds ridiculous. And it's hard to implement these for fleet management. One of the cases was actually reduced from a 10 million euro fine to less than 1 million. And the aspect I want to make you aware of is actually in there, they had a steep learning curve at the regulators, and they probably didn't have the right experience on the criminal law in the sense of issuing and actually enforcing fines in the end, which dogmatically speaking would fall within the remit of criminal law and part of administrative law in Germany. So interestingly, they weren't able to apportion culpability to individuals, which is how it works in criminal law typically. Not exclusively, the landscape will be changing at some point, and there is organizational liability, but culpability in criminal law will have to be appointed personally. So they got that wrong, simply speaking. That's also interesting. I don't want to suggest you'll get away with everything if there's no handwritten decision internally, but it is often part of a defense strategy. One other area I want to go into is legislation, because that was mentioned before. Because I saw so many hands about a German market presence for you, or at least business distribution. You'll probably all have heard about NIS2 implementation. It has been live for 2.5 months now, the registration part. The law has been live for half a year now. I'm not asking who registered for NIS2 in Germany, but I would say it's still a mess, and it's very likely not everybody has registered. I mean, there was supposed to be a solid five-digit number of companies who've newly fell within NIS2 after NIS1, and not all of them will have registered by now. The real mess is, and maybe we can discuss later over lunch, between the jurisdictions, even within the EU, because we've seen different guidance from different countries. If you just think about applicability, and one of the major points is the main establishment principle, and this is driving people crazy, I can say. I mean, we're helping lots of clients finding a solution where you can argue for a main establishment, where it's MSP or MSSP, but then you bring up these discussions. But if an incident is just in one country, is there a way to argue, I just report that in one country? And if yes, which is it? Is it the local one where maybe they don't have a regulator yet? maybe that's an interesting choice if there's no regulator and means for reporting incidents. So maybe you can't do that. Those kinds of discussions are really driving people nuts, because no one wants to proactively report too many incidents. It doesn't help anyone. That will be my personal view, but it's really difficult to find a harmonized approach to this too, and this will stay. We just heard from Carlos, we don't have a law in Spain, and there are a couple other countries. So that strategy is really important to strike a balance between registrations and reporting of incidents, but maybe not over-reporting, over-registering. And maybe a couple points are, the AI Act and Data Act and Data Governance Act. We do have sort of laws, some just in draft form, some have been passed by Parliament, but not been published in the Gazette. So Germany is not in last place, probably. Someone mentioned DSC, maybe not a good topic. So we do have laws on implementation, but you can probably work with your strategy on AI Act implementation, Data Act, Data Governance Act, if it applies to you, and harmonize that, because in Germany so far it's mostly about appointing regulators, procedures, certifications, that sort of thing. And again, criminal law aspects about finding companies where required. So no material deviations, which would be difficult anyways under the acts and regulations. So that's been worked on. One trend I want to mention, I'm not sure whether regulators are in the room already. NOYB is going after at least 3 of the 18 German GDPR regulators. Super interesting. I'm on the outside for that one, so this is going to be very interesting to see how it plays out. One of the approaches is to say that 2 of the German states level regulators have not taken measures where there's allegedly clear breaches of GDPR. One of the reasons, one of the cases was PimEyes, the online search engine for images. And the company apparently is registered in Dubai, and the Hamburg regulator said, yeah, no chance of enforcing anything. So NOYB says, yeah, but you at least have to try. And maybe you can have someone seize monies or freeze monies. Maybe you can go after vendors they use in the processing chain. Super interesting, I think, how this is going to play out. And maybe that's it for time. Yeah? Okay. But please do raise questions to the panel. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Thorsten. So it's now down to me to say just a few words about the UK without stealing William Malcolm's thunder for when he turns up later on. So I need to step very carefully here. First point that I just wanted to make is that the UK, I think, remains at the vanguard of looking after children's data online. I mean, we have seen a relatively large fine from the ICO this year against Reddit that was relating to age assurance and also an inappropriate or not adequate data protection impact assessment. Please note that DPIAs are here to stay. So we do see activity from the ICO and Ofcom. We see enforcements under the Online Safety Act. If you have anything to do with children's data, or if children might possibly be interested in your service, you need to be thinking about this area. You need to be active here. The next thing I wanted to raise was, do we have any new laws coming in? We've heard about that in other jurisdictions. Well, we heard the King's speech yesterday, so we know that apparently we're going to have a digital ID. I'm old enough to remember when we were going to have a digital ID in the 90s. I shall wait and see if that actually exists. But we will expect some laws on cybersecurity. Nothing was said specifically on AI. However, we did have DUA, did we not? We all know that we had DUA. Things that you need to know about DUA that haven't already been mentioned is the 19th of June is coming up. That is a significant date for your compliance activities. You are meant to have a complaints process by that point in time. It's not a heavy lift, in my view. It ought to be relatively simple to sort. you may have received some information from Fieldfisher about the complaints process. If you haven't got it, please speak to one of us. We can send that to you. Please get it in place, because it's a really easy thing for someone who has beef against your business. You know, they've made a DSAR, they've made a deletion request, they've made a complaint. If you haven't got a complaints process, they can then complain about the fact that you haven't got a complaints process. Don't get there, okay? The second thing to note is just that the cookies fines have now gone up to the GDPR level. So I know it's all our favorite topic dealing with cookies, but it's a really simple thing for a regulator to check. It's a really simple thing for an individual to check on your website. So back to cookie compliance. And the last point I just wanted to raise was surprise, surprise, DSARs. And that is something that continues to fill up a lot of our time and our clients' time and cause grey hair and pulling out of hair. We do see a lot of DSARs still in the UK. They are a volume where we try to involve our colleagues in Condor who will help with a low-cost option to deal with DSARs, and also complexity. We're seeing DSARs that are combined with difficult complaints, litigation, employment-related disputes. And then the strategy is quite important. The timing of release of data is very important. So please do keep up to speed on your DSARs. You know, they're coming to get you. In the last few weeks, though, I can say that I have noticed across our offices a difference in approach in how other regulators might look at DSARs. And I've got some bad news for you. We've made it really difficult for ourselves in the UK. If you were all qualified somewhere else, like Spain or the Netherlands, you'd have an easier life. I'm sorry, that's just the way it is. So I am going to finish up on the UK now and throw it open to everyone here to come up with some questions. Remember, if you don't have questions, I will be posing my nastiest questions to my lovely colleagues. So it's down to you. We have a roving mic. Any questions, please? Oh, lady at the front here. Chloe is wending her way towards you right now.
Thank you. And thank you for that insightful panel. I thought it was fascinating. So I have two questions, actually. So one regarding the EU regulators. I was wondering if you have, you know, at the top of your head, have any ratio about how many of the fines by the regulators withstand judicial review. And I say that because, you know, I feel like in the US, especially in the Silicon Valley, there's this perception that maybe these regulators are being overly conservative and, you know, relying like very hefty fines, but maybe 50% of the time that's not going to withstand the judicial review, and that fine is not that scary anymore when you know that it could be actually canceled. My second question is about the US. So I was wondering if you had any of your clients' reaction to the upcoming personal liability under the CCPA. Are people adopting it, or is there a wait and see approach? And similar to how, you know, other US states follow the California and CCPA, do you think more states will have personal liability in their privacy laws? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's take the second question
Yeah.
first, if that's okay.
Sorry, am I on?
Natalie F.
Hi. Yeah, it's a great question. I think on the California front, they're obviously held up as sort of the leaders of the pack. We expected, or I expected at least, for other states to maybe to follow slightly more closely. We've seen much more narrower data privacy and AI laws in other states. The CCPA is also the only law that's, I think, being very actively enforced, as opposed to perhaps certain enforcement priorities of the AGs in other states pulling in the relevant privacy laws. I'm not aware of any trend towards personal liability in other states. Having said that, it's not, we're still seeing a lot of movement in the legal landscape among other states. We've only got 21 out of 50 states with laws online. We can expect to see that increase. There's certain states I don't expect necessarily to enact laws in this space, but I don't think you could rule anything out. I do think California continues to stand slightly alone in the way that it approaches this, though. And I can't see a different state law surpassing it.
Thank you very much. I'm going to say a few words about the first question that you posed, and then maybe turn it over to colleagues to see if they'd like to throw something in there. I think you raise a very interesting point, and certainly from a UK perspective, some of the initial fines that we saw under the GDPR changed radically. I'm not sure that I see that trend continuing. I think the UK fines seem to be relatively stable when they come out now. I don't know if others would like to speak to whether fines change.
Yes. Well, in Belgium, all decision can be challenged before the market court, so in appeal, and there are all types of decisions of the DPA can go there. It ends up in many decisions being annulled, modified, and the amount of the fine is usually reduced. So, well, and also during this appeal procedure, the decision of the DPA can be suspended. So this is actually reducing a lot the interest of all the DPA decisions. So there is a very, I would say, intensive judicial review there. And this, is diminishing, I think, the power of all the DPA decision. And this system of appeal is being challenged by many stakeholders in Belgium, and especially the Data Protection Authority itself is saying this is a bad system because for any decision, it will take between 4 to 5 years of proceedings. And most of the time, once the decision is being appealed before the market court, a preliminary question will be asked to the European Union Court of Justice. So this is explaining why it's taking so much time.
Yeah, from Spain, the perspective, if I remember correctly, because this is explained in the yearly report that the Data Protection Authority is publishing every year. And if I'm not wrong, if from all the decisions that are appealed or challenged before the Court of Justice, more or less 25%, the decision by the Court of Justice, the Court of Appeal is it's a national court. 25%, they repeal the decision of the authority, and the other 3/4, let's say 75%, they confirm the decision of the authority. We have to bear in mind that we have I think that this is depending on every judicial system, and Spain is slightly different. Because, of course, you can challenge the decision before the Court of Justice, but in nearly all occasions, if you want to do that, you have to post the amount of the fine at the court's account in order just to be able to challenge the decision. So that amount is there until the decision is taken by the court. And it's in Belgium. It might take 2 or 3 years. I mean, we have a client that is waiting for a decision from this court for nearly 3 years. On a decision that it is about a fine, the proposal of fine is 25,000 euro, which is ridiculous. But that's the way it works. But just long story short, 25% the repeal, 75% confirmation. But this is an information that appears in every single report, yearly report that the Data Protection Authority publishes in Spain.
That's interesting in terms of budgeting for courts and regulators. I hadn't heard that one. I don't have statistics for Germany across the country. Again, very disparate landscape. I'd say it works structurally similar to what Nathalie said about Belgium. You will, especially for the higher fines, you will very often find good reasons how to reduce them. There will have been mistakes in administrative proceedings, because everything will be checked. You'll first ask for the files, you'll go through them, you will find mistakes, just like the regulator will find gaps in your compliance. So this works for both sides.
And just on the US sentiment, because you mentioned sort of the Silicon Valley sentiment of perhaps caring a little bit less about that enforcement, we definitely saw that among US clients. And I sort of thought really it was under the current administration where there was a move to sort of deregulate and move fast and break things in the US. I'm seeing a bit of a turning point on that now with US clients where they're coming back to putting some focus into EU compliance, not necessarily because they think that there's sentiment in the US to do so, but more the client drivers in the EU and the UK. So getting deals signed. It's all well and good saying, well, our administration doesn't care. We're just going to plow on. We want to be competitive. We're going to take over the world. But if you can't sell into the European markets, there's a huge commercial driver there as well as obviously the regulatory spectre.
Thank you. Any other questions, please? Oh, there's a hand here at the front.
I have a question regarding data residency. So I've become aware of a couple of, I suppose, moves in Germany where they are trying to convince regulators, German federal and state regulators, to enforce German data in Germany rules. Is that something that you're seeing across other regulators? That is a slight departure from EU level data residency requirements.
Are you asking specifically about Germany, or is this all set and you want to know about the other jurisdictions?
Yeah, it's more about the other jurisdictions. I'm aware that it's being discussed at a German level, and there is some pushback there, but it's obviously concerning if most of us are operating against European Union data centers.
If I may comment one point on that, I think you can push back quite some time and hard because of EU level harmonization. Data residency can work in specific sectors, maybe for tax, maybe in finance. In one state, there's a law about schools that has something. It's all a bit odd and again disparate, but it would be hard in Germany to implement anything that opposes freedom of data, movement of data.
You mean within? Sorry, you mean within the European Union or outside the European Union? Because it's within the European Union. I mean, I agree with Thorsten. I mean, if it's outside the European Union, that's a different thing because there's strategic information that compulsory must be located, even in Spain. I mean, for certain information. But if it's within the European Union, I mean, it's a single market.
Thank you. Oh, another question?
Thank you. We were looking at a meeting internally the other day. Someone was dealing with an FTC decision and guidance on AI. It's for some time we've seen the FTC as a competition body. We've seen for some time that privacy and competition are converging as policy areas. Are we now also therefore seeing AI, privacy and competition converging as policy areas? Are we heading towards a sort of grander plan?
I mean, I'm happy to take that in the first instance. So I think it's applicable not only from the US, but of course across the EU and the UK as well. I would say so. And I would say that, I mean, the thing about the FTC is obviously they've got that broad scope to enforce against a lot of consumer practices that pull in antitrust, that pull in privacy and increasingly pull in AI using the same very narrowly written power, but very broadly used power to protect consumers against those unfair practices. So there you've got a convergence that happens naturally because of a lack of other law. But I think it's fair to say that there's too much overlap. Putting antitrust aside a little bit, obviously there are thresholds there, but privacy and AI, given data use, reuse, the need to comply with automated decision-making rules, as well as the broader breadth of laws like the GDPR, absolutely. You almost can't talk about the two things in the same breath without, really pulling together a sort of one coherent plan for the two. And we were talking actually just before the panel started about how often conversations with clients talk about AI. We start talking about the EU AI Act and whether it does or doesn't apply. And very quickly we start talking about, well, actually, your use case is highly regulated, just not necessarily highly regulated under the GDPR, but in fact, under the EU AI Act, but in fact, under the GDPR, those existing rules, which we are now re-examining because the technology, and it being a technology neutral regulation, requires us to apply it in a different way. So to your question, yes, I think the answer is yes. I think the US and the European approach is different, but a similar trend.
I can confirm for Germany too. One of the mechanisms how to enforce the law is not via regulators, but you use competition law to go after competitors. And you can basically use any legal regime, any area of law, whether it's privacy or AI compliance or consumer protection or anything else around advertising, for instance. So that definitely there is a convergence and has been for decades, and there's tons of case law.
Yeah, I would add another comment. I mean, it's not just on competition law, is the intersection that this digital regulation might have with other specific legislations. And let me give you an example. As I was explaining that in Spain, we don't have the penalty regime yet on artificial intelligence, for instance, but there are other laws that they have a penalty regime and they are intersecting with AI legislation. A couple of examples. Now we have regulation just implementing European directives on payroll transparency.